Tanya sat in the cold, sterile courtroom, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the judge's words. She clutched the edge of the wooden bench, her knuckles turning white as the verdict came down. She was losing custody of her son. The words hit her like a punch in the gut. Her breath caught in her throat, and her mind went blank. For a moment, everything around her seemed to freeze. Time, space, even the air she struggled to breathe. How could this be happening? She was a good mother. Her only crime, it seemed, was fitting into someone else's narrative. A single black mother from a low-income neighborhood. That was all they saw. Across the room, the foster parents, a white couple, smiling and reassuring, who looked like the image of a perfect family, nodded in approval. They had come in with no baggage, no presumptions weighing against them. But for Tanya, the presumption was clear. She was unfit, not because of any actions, but because of perceptions rooted in prejudice and stereotypes. Tanya's lawyer, a public defender with too many cases and not enough time, mumbled words of apology. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. As the bailiff guided her out of the courtroom, Tanya felt her legs wobble, threatening to give out. She had fought so hard for this moment, convinced that the truth would be enough. But the truth, as she was beginning to learn, didn't always matter in a world where the system was rigged against you. Outside, the bright sun contrasted sharply with the darkness she felt inside. She walked in a daze, clutching her bag tightly, trying to process what had just happened. Her son, Malik, was just 7 years old, too young to understand the complexities of the legal system, but old enough to know that he was being taken from his mother. The image of his wide, tear-filled eyes as they had told him the decision haunted her. How was she supposed to explain that the system had failed them? Tanya couldn't cry. Not here. Not in public. She had learned long ago that showing vulnerability was dangerous. People were always watching, always judging. But inside, she was breaking apart, piece by piece. How had her life come to this? As she walked down the steps of the courthouse, her mind raced back to the events leading up to this nightmare. The false accusations had come out of nowhere. A teacher claiming that Malik had spoken about unsafe conditions at home. It was a misunderstanding, but it spiraled quickly. In her community, any whiff of trouble, and social services swooped in without asking too many questions. The investigation felt more like an interrogation. Every question seemed loaded, every glance heavy with suspicion. No matter how much evidence Tanya provided, no matter how many times she proved that her home was safe, that her son was loved, the system had already made up its mind. Now, with the final blow struck, she stood on the edge of an abyss. The thought of going back to an empty home, without the sound of Malik's laughter, without his presence, was too much to bear. But beneath the overwhelming sorrow, there was something else beginning to stir, an anger, a fire that had been buried deep inside her for years. She wasn't going to let this be the end of their story. She couldn't. Tanya knew one thing for certain. She had to fight, not just for herself, but for Malik, for all the other mothers who had been in her shoes, and for the children who were taken without real cause. She didn't know how just yet, but she was determined. This wasn't over. Tanya spent the next few days in a haze of exhaustion and grief. The silence in her small apartment was suffocating. Malik's toys were still scattered around the living room, his favorite superhero figurine lying abandoned under the couch, like the life they had once shared. Each time she passed his empty room, it felt like another dagger to the heart. But grief couldn't keep her down for long. The anger inside her, the sheer injustice of what had happened, was simmering, turning her sorrow into a determination she hadn't felt before. She had no legal background, no wealthy connections, no real support. But she had something else, a fierce love for her son, and the knowledge that if she didn't fight, no one else would. Tanya knew she couldn't rely on the public defender, who had barely put up a fight in court. If she wanted to win Malik back, She had to take matters into her own hands. The first thing she needed was information, so she found herself in the local library, a place she hadn't visited in years, sitting in front of a computer with legal textbooks piled around her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Where did she even begin? Family law was a maze, and each case was unique. But as she scrolled through article after article, one thing became clear. The system wasn't designed for people like her. The racial biases, the economic disparities, it was all built into the framework. The more she read, the angrier she got. But anger wasn't enough. Tanya needed a plan. One of the librarians, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, noticed a stack of books and the determined look on Tanya's face. "Are you studying for something in particular?" she asked softly, sitting down next to her. Tanya hesitated for a moment, not used to sharing her personal struggles with strangers. But something in the woman's tone made her feel like she could open up. "I'm trying to get my son back," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "They took him because of lies, because of who I am." The librarian's eyes softened further. "That's a heavy burden to carry," she said, pausing for a moment before continuing. "But I've seen many people come through here, fighting for their children, fighting for their rights. It's not impossible." Encouraged by the woman's words, Tanya continued her research with a renewed sense of purpose. She read about similar cases, other mothers who had lost custody due to false accusations, women who had fought the system and won. It was an uphill battle, but it was possible. Tanya realized she would need more than just knowledge. She needed allies. She started attending community meetings, speaking with civil rights advocates and legal aid groups. There were people who had seen this kind of injustice before, people who understood what she was up against. Slowly, she built a network of support, gathering advice from anyone willing to offer it. Late one night, after hours of research, Tanya found herself sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by notes and case files, feeling the weight of exhaustion pulling at her. She hadn't slept properly in days, her mind constantly racing with strategies and what-ifs. But she couldn't afford to stop now. Then she came across a case that caught her eye, a woman, not unlike herself, who had faced the same battle and had won. The case was a landmark decision, one that changed the way custody battles were fought in that particular state. The woman had gone to law school, representing herself in court when no one else would. It was a long shot, but it planted a seed in Tanya's mind. She didn't have the time or the money to go to law school herself, but maybe there was a way. Maybe, if she could learn enough on her own, she could start making moves to appeal her case. Her decision was made. This wasn't just about getting her son back. This was about fighting for the rights of people who looked like her, people who had been marginalized and dismissed by the system for too long. She was going to study law. Maybe not formally, maybe not with a degree, but she would learn everything she needed to win. For Malik, for herself, for all the mothers like her. Tanya's days became a blur of research, community meetings, and phone calls. Her apartment, once filled with Malik's laughter, was now a battlefield of legal texts and case notes. Every spare moment she had, she spent studying, understanding the ins and outs of family law, racial bias in the justice system, and custody disputes. She often worked late into the night, her only company the low hum of the city outside her window. The weight of the challenge she had taken on was immense, and there were moments when the fear of failure was almost paralyzing. But every time she thought about giving up, she'd look at Malik's picture on the fridge, a photo of him smiling wide, missing one front tooth, and she'd find the strength to keep going. The first step was to file an appeal. Tanya had no idea where to start, but with the help of the contacts she'd made in the community, she was pointed in the right direction. One of the legal aid groups she had reached out to introduced her to Sarah, a lawyer who had dedicated her career to civil rights cases. Sarah was a white woman in her 40s, known for taking on cases that no one else would touch. Her office was small and cluttered, but the moment Tanya stepped inside, she felt a sense of hope. "I've read through your case," Sarah said, glancing up from the stack of papers on her desk. "What happened to you was wrong, Tanya, and we're going to fight it." Tanya had been expecting skepticism or caution, but Sarah's confidence took her by surprise. She wasn't used to people fighting for her. Not like this. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Tanya worked closely together to prepare the appeal. Tanya attended every meeting, every strategy session, asking questions, learning the process. She was no longer the passive client being spoken for. She was an active part of her own defense. And as they prepared to take on the system, Tanya could feel herself changing. One afternoon, while reviewing documents in Sarah's office, Tanya spoke up. "I've been reading about cases similar to mine," she said, her voice steady. "The patterns are always the same: racial bias, poor defense, and assumptions about what it means to be a black mother. I don't just want to win this case for myself. I want to help others who are going through the same thing." Sarah paused, leaning back in her chair. "That's a big goal," she said, her eyes meeting Tanya's. "But it's possible. You're smart, you're driven, and you understand the system in a way that most people don't." Tanya smiled, feeling the weight of Sarah's words. For the first time, she felt seen, not just as a client, not just as a mother, but as a woman who could make a real difference. But the road ahead wasn't easy. The appeal process was long and grueling. There were court dates, hearings, and more paperwork than Tanya had ever imagined. The opposing lawyer tried to undermine her at every turn, painting her as unstable, as unfit. But Tanya stood her ground, refusing to let the lies and stereotypes defeat her. Each court appearance was a test of her strength. She would stand in front of the judge, her heart racing. But with Sarah by her side, she learned to control the fear. There were times when the judge seemed indifferent, when the system felt like an immovable wall. But Tanya was relentless. She presented evidence, she called witnesses, and she made sure her voice was heard. In the midst of all this, Tanya's relationship with her son was strained. She could only see Malik during supervised visits, and each time they parted, it broke her heart a little more. Malik didn't understand why he couldn't come home, and no matter how much Tanya tried to explain, he was too young to grasp the full scope of what was happening. The visits were brief, and each time they ended, Malik would cry, clinging to her until the supervisor gently pulled him away. Those moments were the hardest for Tanya. They reminded her why she was fighting, why she couldn't give up, even when the odds seemed stacked against her. Months passed, and the case moved slowly through the courts. Tanya was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but every small victory, the judge granting another hearing, a motion in her favor, gave her the strength to keep going. She was no longer just a mother fighting for her child. She was a woman taking on an entire system, and she was winning one step at a time. The appeal had officially been granted, and while it was a small victory, Tanya knew it was only the beginning. The court had agreed to hear her case again, giving her the chance to prove the injustice she had faced. But this time, she wasn't just relying on her lawyer. Tanya had become her own advocate. As they prepared for the new trial, Tanya began working with Sarah to dig deeper into the case that had originally taken her son away. They pored over the records, looking for any discrepancies, any evidence that could expose the racial bias and stereotyping at the heart of the initial ruling. One day, during a particularly long session in Sarah's office, Tanya came across something that made her stomach turn. There it was, in black and white. Testimony from a social worker who had cited Tanya's attitude and demeanor as reasons for questioning her fitness as a mother. It was a vague, racially coded description that had no basis in fact, but it had been enough to sway the court against her. "That's it," Tanya said, her voice shaking with anger as she pushed the paper across Sarah's desk. "They didn't care about the facts. They didn't care about me. They just saw a black woman, and decided I wasn't fit to be a mother. Sarah frowned, reading over the testimony. "This is exactly what we need," she said. "We can use this to show the bias that was present in the original ruling. It's not just about you, Tanya. It's about the system and how it treats black mothers." Tanya nodded, her resolve hardening. She had known all along that this was bigger than her case, but seeing it written so plainly brought a new level of urgency to her fight. She wasn't just battling for Malik anymore. She was fighting for every woman who had been judged unfairly, for every mother who had lost her child because of the color of her skin. The days leading up to the trial were a blur of preparation. Sarah coached Tanya on how to testify, how to stay calm under questioning, and how to keep her emotions in check, even when the other side tried to provoke her. It was a delicate balance. Tanya wanted to show her passion, to make the court understand how much this fight meant to her. But she also knew that any sign of anger or frustration could be used against her. When the day of the trial finally arrived, Tanya walked into the courtroom with her head held high. The opposing lawyer glanced at her briefly, but she could tell he didn't take her seriously. To him, she was just another desperate mother, another case to win. But Tanya knew better. She wasn't the same woman who had stood before the court months ago. She was stronger now, more determined, and she had the truth on her side. The trial began with Sarah presenting their case, outlining the ways in which the original decision had been tainted by bias. She called witnesses to testify on Tanya's behalf. Friends, neighbors, even teachers from Malik's school who spoke to her character and her love for her son. Tanya watched as each person took the stand, feeling a swell of gratitude for their support. But the opposing lawyer wasn't going to make it easy. When it was his turn, he focused on the same stereotypes that had been used against Tanya from the beginning. He questioned her ability to manage her time, given her work schedule. He implied that she was emotionally unstable, pointing to moments of frustration during her supervised visits with Malik as evidence. Tanya clenched her fists under the table, trying to stay calm. She wanted to scream, to tell the court how unfair this all was, but she knew that wasn't the way. Instead, she focused on the facts, on the truth that had brought her this far. When it was finally Tanya's turn to testify, the courtroom fell silent. She took a deep breath as she stepped up to the stand, feeling the weight of every eye on her. The opposing lawyer wasted no time, immediately launching into a series of questions designed to trip her up. He asked about her financial situation, about her work hours, about the stress she had been under during the original trial. But Tanya didn't flinch. She answered every question with calm precision, refusing to let the lawyer's attempts to rattle her succeed. She spoke about her love for Malik, about the lengths she had gone to provide for him, and about the pain of being separated from him for so long. And then, finally, she spoke about the bias. She described the feeling of being judged not for her actions, but for her race. She talked about the stereotypes that had been used against her, and about how they had influenced the court's decision. As she spoke, Tanya could see the faces of the jury members softening. They were listening. They were starting to understand. When she finished, there was a long pause before the judge finally spoke. "Thank you, Ms. Williams," he said, his voice measured. "We will reconvene tomorrow to continue deliberations." Tanya stepped down from the stand, her heart racing. She had done everything she could. Now, all she could do was wait. The days after Tanya's testimony were some of the longest she'd ever experienced. Waiting for the jury's decision felt like torture, each minute dragging on longer than the last. She spent most of her time pacing her small apartment, unable to focus on anything else. Her mother, who had been her rock throughout this entire process, tried to keep her distracted. They cooked meals together, watched movies, and went on long walks through the neighborhood, but nothing could ease the weight pressing down on Tanya's chest. All she could think about was Malik. She imagined his face when she finally told him that they could be together again, that their nightmare was over. But the fear of losing the case lingered, creeping into her thoughts at every quiet moment. Sarah checked in regularly, providing updates when she could. It's normal for juries to take their time, she reassured Tanya during one phone call. Don't read too much into it. But Tanya couldn't help it. The silence from the courtroom was deafening, and every day that passed without a verdict felt like another reminder of how much power the system held over her life, how much she still had to prove. One evening, as the sun was setting, Tanya found herself at the park where she and Malik used to spend weekends. She sat on a bench, watching children play on the swings and imagining what life would be like once he was home again. Would things go back to the way they were? Could she rebuild the relationship that had been torn apart by months of separation? Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her pocket and her heart skipped a beat. She fumbled to answer it, her hands trembling. "It's Sarah," came the familiar voice on the other end. "The jury has reached a verdict." Tanya's heart raced as she listened. "We need to be at the courthouse first thing tomorrow morning." That night, sleep was impossible. Tanya lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with 1,000 scenarios. What if the jury didn't believe her? What if they sided with the lawyer, with the system that had already failed her so many times before? The next morning, Tanya dressed carefully, choosing the same outfit she had worn on the first day of the trial. It felt symbolic, a small way to remind herself of how far she had come and how much was at stake. When she arrived at the courthouse, Sarah was already there, waiting for her at the entrance. "No matter what happens today," Sarah said, placing a hand on Tanya's shoulder, "you've done something incredible. You stood up for yourself. You stood up for Malik. That's something no one can ever take away from you." Tanya nodded, swallowing hard. Her throat was dry, her palms sweaty, but she managed a small smile in response. "Thank you," she whispered. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Tanya could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her as the judge called the court to order. The jury filed in, their expressions unreadable, and Tanya's heart pounded in her chest. She gripped the edge of the table, bracing herself for whatever was about to come. The foreman of the jury stood, a folded piece of paper in his hand. Tanya held her breath, every muscle in her body tense. This was it, the moment that would determine everything. "The jury finds in favor of the plaintiff," the foreman announced. Tanya blinked, her brain struggling to process the words. In favor of the plaintiff. They had won. She had won. She turned to Sarah, who was grinning from ear to ear. "We did it," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with emotion. Tanya felt a sob rise in her throat, tears welling up in her eyes. The relief was overwhelming, crashing over her like a wave. She had fought for Malik, for their family, and she had won. As the courtroom emptied, Tanya stood for a moment, staring at the spot where the jury had sat. She had dreamed of this day for so long, and now that it was here, she almost couldn't believe it was real. Outside the courthouse, a group of reporters had gathered, eager for a statement. Sarah handled most of the questions, but when one journalist asked Tanya how she felt about the verdict, she paused for a moment before answering. "I'm relieved," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "But this isn't just a victory for me. It's a victory for every mother who has been judged unfairly, for every family that's been torn apart by bias. This fight isn't over." As she walked away from the cameras, Tanya felt lighter than she had in months. She had faced the system and won, but she knew this was just the beginning. There were so many other women like her, still fighting, still waiting for their day in court, and Tanya was determined to help them. The days following the verdict felt like a blur for Tanya. The overwhelming relief of winning her case had left her emotionally drained. But there was also a quiet determination that grew inside her each day. She had fought the system and won, but the fight for justice didn't end with her victory. There were others, countless others, facing the same challenges she had endured. Back at home, Tanya and Malik began the process of rebuilding their relationship. After so much time apart, it wasn't as simple as she had hoped. Malik, now a few years older, had grown used to living with his foster family. He had questions, hard questions, about why he had been taken away in the first place, why the system had treated him the way it had. "I missed you every day," Malik said one evening as they sat together in the living room, the TV playing softly in the background. "But I didn't understand why you couldn't come and get me, why it took so long." Tanya's heart ached at his words. She had always known this conversation would come, but hearing it still felt like a punch to the gut. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before answering. "I wanted to, Malik, more than anything, but the system didn't see us for who we are. They judged us based on things that had nothing to do with the truth." Malik looked up at her, his eyes searching hers for answers. "Like what?" Tanya hesitated, unsure of how to explain the complexities of systemic racism to her young son. "Because we're different," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "Because of the color of our skin. Some people don't see that as just skin. They see it as a reason to make assumptions, to judge us unfairly. And that's what happened to us." Malik was quiet for a long time, processing her words. "But you fought back," he said after a while. "You didn't give up." Tanya smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't, and I never will." Their bond, though bruised, was healing. They spent more time together than they had in years, slowly building new memories to replace the painful ones. They went on walks, visited the park, and spent long afternoons at the library, where Malik had developed a love for reading. Meanwhile, Tanya found herself drawn to advocacy work. She began attending community meetings, sharing her story with other mothers who had faced similar struggles. The more she spoke out, the more she realized how deep the problem went. There were so many families, particularly Black and marginalized ones, being torn apart by a system that was supposed to protect them. One afternoon, as she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by legal documents and case studies, an idea began to take shape. What if she could create a network, a support system for mothers like her? A place where they could come for legal advice, emotional support, and resources to fight back against unjust rulings? She brought the idea to Sarah, who had become a close friend as well as her attorney. "I want to help other women," Tanya said, her voice filled with passion. "There are so many out there still fighting. I can't just walk away now." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I think that's a brilliant idea, but it's going to take a lot of work. Are you ready for that?" Tanya smiled, feeling a spark of excitement she hadn't felt in a long time. "I've never been more ready." Together, they began to sketch out the details of the project. Tanya would start small, reaching out to local community organizations, building a network of volunteers and legal experts willing to donate their time. But as the weeks passed, the idea grew. Soon, Tanya was giving talks at schools, churches, and community centers, her story inspiring others to join the cause. Her home became a hub of activity, with boxes of flyers, pamphlets, and legal resources cluttering the kitchen table. Malik, always curious, would often sit with her, asking questions about the cases she was working on. "Are you going to help more kids come home?" he asked one evening, looking up from his homework. Tanya smiled, reaching over to ruffle his hair. "That's the plan, buddy. That's the plan." Her new advocacy work filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since before the trial. Every story she heard, every mother she met, reminded her of why she had fought so hard in the first place. And every time she helped someone navigate the legal system, she felt like she was giving a little bit of herself back to the world. But it wasn't just about winning cases. It was about changing minds, reshaping the way people thought about motherhood, race, and justice. It was about making sure that no one else had to endure the same pain she and Malik had suffered. As she looked around her busy, cluttered home, Tanya felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had lost so much, but she had gained something far more valuable. A new sense of purpose, a mission that extended beyond herself and her family. This was just the beginning. Tanya's life was now a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and late-night work sessions. Her advocacy organization, named Mothers for Justice, had grown from a small local initiative into a national movement. People were taking notice, and Tanya was becoming a respected figure in the world of civil rights activism. Her story was featured in news articles, and she was invited to speak at conferences and rallies across the country. Despite her growing prominence, Tanya remained grounded. Her priority was still Malik, and every night she made sure to spend time with him, helping with his homework, attending his school events, and simply enjoying the little moments that motherhood had to offer. Their relationship had strengthened over time, and Malik was flourishing at school, no longer burdened by the uncertainty and fear that had once overshadowed their lives. One evening, as Tanya was preparing for an important speech at a national civil rights conference, Malik sat at the kitchen table, watching her go over her notes. "You're going to change the world, Mom," he said with a wide grin. Tanya smiled, though her heart swelled with emotion. "I'm trying, baby, but I couldn't do it without you." The conference was a major event in Washington, D.C., with thousands of activists, lawmakers, and community leaders in attendance. Tanya's speech was set to be the highlight of the day, and she felt the weight of that responsibility as she stood backstage, waiting to be introduced. She had spent years fighting for this moment, fighting for recognition not just for herself, but for every mother who had been silenced, overlooked, or wronged by the system. As her name was announced, the audience erupted in applause. Tanya stepped out onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding her. She took a deep breath, scanning the faces of the crowd, and began to speak. "I stand before you today as a mother, a fighter, and a woman who has seen the devastating effects of a broken system. I know what it's like to be judged, to be told that your worth is less because of the color of your skin or your place in society. But I also know the power of resilience, of standing up and saying, 'No more.'" The room was silent, every eye fixed on Tanya as she continued to share her journey, her struggles, her victories, and the ongoing fight for justice. She spoke of the mothers she had met, the families torn apart by bias and discrimination, and the children who had suffered as a result. Her voice was steady, but there was a fire behind her words, a passion that had been forged in the crucible of her own experience. As she finished her speech, the crowd rose to their feet, the applause thunderous and unrelenting. Tanya stood there for a moment, overwhelmed by the support and validation of her work. It was a moment she would never forget. Backstage, as she prepared to leave, a woman approached her. She was in her mid-40s, with tired eyes and a weary expression. "I just wanted to thank you," the woman said, her voice trembling. "Your story, it's my story too. I've been fighting for my kids for years, and hearing you today gave me hope. Please don't stop." Tanya felt tears prick her eyes as she embraced the woman. "I won't stop," she promised. "I'll keep fighting for you, for all of us." That night, as she returned home, Malik was waiting for her in the living room, a huge smile on his face. "I watched your speech online, Mom. You were amazing." Tanya laughed, pulling him into a hug. "Thanks, baby. But it's not just about me. It's about all the families out there who need someone to fight for them." As they sat together, Malik looked up at her, his eyes filled with curiosity. "Do you think I can help too? Like when I'm older?" Tanya smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Of course you can. You can do anything you set your mind to." The idea of legacy had been on Tanya's mind a lot lately. She had started Mothers for Justice to help other women, but as the movement grew, she began to see it as something that could last long after she was gone. She wanted to create something that would continue to fight for families, that would challenge the system and push for change, even when she was no longer there to lead it. In the months that followed, Tanya worked tirelessly to expand the organization's reach. She hired staff, opened new offices, and began partnering with other civil rights groups to push for legislative reforms. Her work was making an impact. More mothers were getting the legal support they needed, more families were being reunited, and the public was starting to pay attention to the systemic injustices that had long been ignored. But despite all the progress, Tanya knew the fight was far from over. There were still so many hurdles to overcome, so many hearts and minds to change. And while the journey ahead seemed daunting, she was more determined than ever to keep moving forward. As she sat in her office late one night, reviewing case files and planning her next steps, Tanya took a moment to reflect on how far she had come. From a young mother fighting to keep her child, to a national figure in the fight for justice, her journey had been long and painful, but it had shaped her into the woman she was today. And as long as there were mothers out there who needed help, she knew she would never stop fighting. Months turned into a year, and Tanya's organization, Mothers for Justice, continued to thrive, making significant strides in advocating for families facing injustice. Tanya found herself on the national stage more often, her voice echoing in the chambers of power where decisions were made. She was not just a representative of her own struggle, but a beacon of hope for countless others. One afternoon, as Tanya prepared for a major press conference, she glanced at the framed photographs on her office wall. Each picture told a story. Malik's first day of school, her early meetings with fellow activists, and the rally that had ignited a spark within her community. They were reminders of how far she had come and the lives she had touched along the way. As she walked into the conference room, Tanya noticed a buzz of excitement in the air. Reporters from all over the country had gathered, eager to hear her speak. The topic of discussion was the upcoming legislation aimed at reforming family court systems, something she had fought for tirelessly. Tanya had been invited to share her insights and experiences, and she knew this was a pivotal moment. Taking a deep breath, she stepped up to the podium. The bright lights of the cameras felt warm on her skin as she scanned the sea of faces. Thank you all for being here today. This isn't just about policy. This is about people, real families whose lives are at stake. I stand here not just as an advocate, but as a mother who has faced the unimaginable. As she spoke, Tanya's words flowed with conviction. She shared stories of the mothers who had come to her for help, their hearts heavy with despair, and how she had seen them transform through advocacy and support. Change is possible, she declared passionately. We can break down the barriers that have kept our families apart for too long, but we need to do it together. The press conference concluded with overwhelming support, and Tanya felt a renewed sense of purpose. As she stepped down from the podium, a reporter approached her. Tanya, your story is inspiring. What's next for you and Mothers for Justice? Tanya smiled, the vision of her future crystal clear in her mind. We're just getting started. We plan to expand our outreach, provide legal workshops, and empower more mothers to fight for their rights. Together, we'll create a system that works for everyone. As the weeks went by, Tanya and her team worked tirelessly to implement their plans. They organized community events, legal clinics, and educational workshops that reached thousands of women across the country. Tanya felt invigorated by the impact they were making, and each success fueled her determination. But the journey was not without its challenges. Despite the progress, there were still those who resisted change, who clung to outdated beliefs and systemic injustices. Tanya faced criticism and pushback, but she remained steadfast, her resolve only strengthening with each obstacle. One evening, as she prepared to leave the office, Tanya received an unexpected phone call. It was Malik. Hey, Mom, guess what? I just got an award at school for a project I did about civil rights. Tanya's heart swelled with pride. That's amazing, Malik. I'm so proud of you. What was your project about? I wrote about you and how you help other moms. Everyone in class loved it. I told them how you fought to get me back. You're my hero, Mom." Tanya felt tears welling in her eyes. "You're my hero too, Malik. You inspire me every day." The connection between them had deepened through this journey. Malik had grown into a thoughtful, compassionate young man who understood the importance of justice and equality. Tanya realized that she was not just building a legacy for herself, but for him and future generations. That night, as they sat together in their cozy living room, Malik asked, "Mom, do you think we'll ever really change the system?" Tanya looked into her son's eyes, filled with hope and determination. "Absolutely. Change takes time, but if we keep pushing, if we keep fighting together, we can make a difference." As Tanya laid down that night, she reflected on her journey, every hardship, every tear shed, every moment of triumph. She had faced the darkest parts of the system, but she had also discovered her strength, her voice, and her purpose. She was more than just a mother. She was a warrior for justice. With a renewed sense of hope, Tanya closed her eyes, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. She knew the fight was ongoing, but she was prepared to lead the charge, not just for herself, but for every mother and child who had been overlooked and undervalued. Tomorrow would bring new battles, but for tonight, she allowed herself to dream of a brighter future. A future where families could thrive without fear, where justice was truly blind, and where love conquered all.